want to first welcome everyone to today's Strategic Farming Let's Talk Crops program. We're happy to have everyone join us today. Today's session is titled, Is Your Water Quality Hurting Your Weed Control? We want to welcome our guest, Greg Dahl, a longtime weed scientist and adjuvant development advisor. He'll kick us off with this presentation, and then will be followed up by Dr. Joe Ikley, Extension Weed Specialist with North Dakota State University. And my name is Eric Yu. I'm an Extension educator with the Crops Field Team. So, Greg, I'll hand it to you, and we can get started.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. All right. So, welcome this morning. I'm glad to talk to you about adjuvants and how we can make your weed control better, especially with regard to the stuff that's in your spray water. So, with that, we'll begin. So I worked for Winfield United and its predecessor companies from 97 until I retired in 2023 and had a wonderful career. This is a picture of the Winfield United Innovation Center. I worked there for 6 years and they've done wonderful things. I'm very proud of the building, the equipment in there, and the people that are there. And it was a real adventure for me. We were able to bring lots of adjuvants to market with some very neat characteristics. So one of the things that happened when my boss, Joe Janowski, retired, he asked me to collect a whole bunch of university data on weed control. And so we went to the University of Minnesota, we went to NDSU, we went to Iowa State, and lots of other places. And what we did was we collected comparisons, and their comparisons were the herbicide alone, the herbicide with the correct adjuvant, the herbicide with an incorrect adjuvant, and then sometimes we were able to compare a good enough adjuvant versus a premium adjuvant. And so we looked at all of these different comparisons and actually came up with thousands of comparisons across the land-grant university system. And so the first thing we have here, what would happen if you applied a herbicide and did not put in the adjuvant that was required to make it work? And we found that we got anywhere from a 30 to 90% reduction in weed control if we left the adjuvant out. That's a pretty big sting. And then another comparison we made is what if you put in the wrong type or the wrong class of adjuvant? And we found there, if we did that, we got somewhere between a 5 to a 50% reduction in performance. And then if we did certain things like we put in an MSO versus a surfactant or a crop oil concentrate compared to instead of a surfactant, we actually did see cases where we had a increase in the amount of crop injury that we saw. And then the last comparison we have here is just picking a good enough adjuvant versus a premium adjuvant. And what we found there was using just a good enough adjuvant versus a premium adjuvant, our weed control was reduced 5 to 25%. And so we really do need to pick the right adjuvant to do the right job. And it started with John Nallawai at North Dakota State University. He said adjuvants are not created equal, and they're not. And so picking the right adjuvant is really important. Joe is going to talk more about this, but one of the best sources of information on adjuvants is the North Dakota Weed Control Guide. And it has lots and lots of pages going through good adjuvant information. So I recommend it. I highly recommend it. And then I want to make you aware of this. I am representing CPDA, and they are the people that make very good adjuvants. We have CPDA certified adjuvants, which I'll talk about later. But one of the things I wanted to make you aware of, if you go to the CPDA site, we put on a series of adjuvant webinars every year. This is our fourth season we just finished. And we will put on like 4 webinars in the spring, 4 webinars in the fall each year. And there's 4 years of adjuvant webinars. And so I encourage you to go see them. You can watch them for free, and I really encourage you to do them. Some of them have been really good. I've been working with this for 2 years, and some of the programs are very, very good and will give you a lot of information. Okay, so let's move to why do we need adjuvants? And one of the things we have here in the Midwest is we have weather. And so temperature can affect our results, humidity, rain, wind, dust, all those kinds of things can have a big effect on our performance. And then, as we're talking about today, things that are in your spray water can have a big effect as well. And for example, the water temperature, the pH, contamination from cations, making hard water, all those things can affect your results. And so we'll go into that a little bit more. And then, of course, as we're mixing up our spray loads to do our weed control or other pesticide applications, we can have problems with foam, compatibility. We want to get a nice, even distribution of our application, and adjuvants can help that out. And then we want to start clean and end clean. And so cleaning out equipment with tank cleaners, things like that, that's an important thing to do. All right. So one of the problems with adjuvants is that they're not really regulated by EPA, and so in the old days, people would just put things together and call it an adjuvant, and they go out on fields, and there's a lot of questionable things going on, and so CPDA put together a voluntary program called CPDA Certified Adjuvants. And what we do there, it's kind of like the CCA program for agronomists. We're trying to bring some order and understanding and trust into the adjuvant market. And so these products have to go through 17 different benchmarks in order to be approved as CPDA certified adjuvants. The products have to be evaluated for safety and toxicity. The labels are looked at, the safety data sheets are looked at, and by a panel of industry experts. And then all of the claims and the ingredients that are on that adjuvant label have to be validated. And then those products can actually be used by the registrants of the herbicide to recommend CPDA certified adjuvants. And we'll go to this slide here. In 2006, EPA allowed manufacturers to put on their label that when an adjuvant is to be used with this product, and then say Bayer or BASF recommends the use of a CPDA certified adjuvant. And so we have about 500 herbicides, insecticides, fungicides that have this wording on their labels that they do recommend CPDA certified adjuvants. And then on the CPDA site, you can actually look at the CPDA certified adjuvants, and they're across lots and lots of different groups, surfactants, oils, drift reduction agents, deposition agents, things like that. And there's over 230 CPDA certified adjuvants at this time. And so that's what I wanted to say about CPDA certified adjuvants. Now we're going to go into some work with herbicide antagonism. This was done by Peter Sikkema over in Ontario, Southern Ontario, and we're looking at the addition of AMS and surfactant to glyphosate. And we're looking at velvet leaf control, or actually we're looking at several weeds, so please look at all the bars. And what we've got there is the gray bars are the amount of weed control we got with hard water. It was 1,000 part per million hard water without an adjuvant system. And then the black bars are actually the amount of weed control we got by adding AMS plus surfactant. And you can see we had 7 to 14% antagonism, not using the adjuvant. And then if we added AMS and surfactant, we got an increase in weed control. The glyphosate rate is very low. And so then was done at a higher glyphosate rate, same study, same everything. And instead of 7 to 14% increase in control using a surfactant, it was only 0 to 7%. So increasing that glyphosate rate reduced the amount of antagonism. And this will work until it doesn't work. And then if we do this one more time, so now we went to a much higher rate of glyphosate, we were basically able to overcome the antagonism in this study. And so you can raise herbicide rates till you can't anymore. And if we need help, the adjuvants can help. This is just a reminder to you. We're going to go into the spraying season. Make sure your sprayer's clean, and then make sure you mix everything at the in the right order. And if you don't know, please do a jar test because we don't want to have 1,000 or 1,200 gallons of a really bad mix because that's not a good day for a whole lot of people. So now switching gear a little bit, I have a saying that sounds kind of dumb, but it helps you visualize it. Plants don't drink rocks. Plants don't drink rocks. And what we have is that as we're spraying, we have evaporation going on with the water quality. We can have minerals in there. And with all of those things, we can end up with particles. And either the particles are there or they land on the leaf surface. And if they're particles, they're not getting in the plant. And so if your herbicide is tied up in this, it's not going to work. And you can get some of these to work if you get dew on it, but some of these crystals don't come back. And so we really need to make sure that we keep things wet as long as we can when we're making post-emergence applications. And then we want to condition that water so that we have good things not turning into crystals on the leaf surface. So this we learned in North Dakota. We started out with a class 1 herbicide that was antagonized to the point it didn't work with very, very hard water. And then over the years, we found it to be a problem with group 1s, group 2s, group 4s, glyphosate, glufosinate, and probably some other products as well. So this can affect a lot of different herbicides if you have hard water. And this is a map of Canada and the United States. You can see as you look at it that southern Minnesota has some pretty hard water there. All of South Dakota, much of North Dakota has very hard water, and conditioning that water is really important. These are 2 glyphosate molecules, and this is calcium. And we have just formed calcium glyphosate, which is a rock. And it's not going to get into the plant, and you can't break this thing apart. You don't get your weed control that you were hoping for. Here's some visuals that came from North Dakota State University. We have a leaf surface that has a deposit of glyphosate and a surfactant on it. Do you see any crystals? You do not. So this glyphosate would actually get in the plant and do what we want it to do. Now we're going to take this and we're going to add calcium to it. Do you see crystals? Yes, you do. And these are the calcium glyphosate crystals that you just saw previously. And so these glyphosate molecules are not going to get in the plant. And then we're going to add AMS to it. And you can see, do you see crystals? Yes, you do. But the crystals are the calcium and the sulfate. And calcium sulfate is gypsum, and it wants to be a rock. And so that's okay if that lands on the leaf surface or the grit inside your spray tank. That's fine because we don't want it anyways. And the ammonia will combine with the glyphosate and stay liquid longer. And the ammonia actually helps the glyphosate get into the plant. And so that's what we're trying to do with AMS. And here I have some comparisons. The black bar is velvet leaf control with hard water. There's 1,000 parts per million water hardness in that black bar. We got 57% velvet leaf control. If you move over to the fourth bar from the right, it says 73. That is the same rate of glyphosate with distilled water. And so because we had bad water, we went from 73% control to 57. That's antagonism due to calcium and magnesium. And then I'd like for you to look at the three bars that are to the right of that distilled water. Those are all, those are actually, there's four of them. But everything to the right of that distilled water are adjuvants that had at least 8.5 pounds of AMS per 100 gallons. And you can see we've completely conditioned the water. We're getting very good results there. And then if you look at the group that is to the left of that 73, in there we have a mixture of acidifiers, things that make very low pHs in that spray solution, or sequestering agents, which keep scale and things like that from forming. And so it keeps the calcium and the magnesium from combining with the glyphosate. And if you look at that, these are very expensive products. And so this is the labeled rate for these products. And we didn't get much movement in water conditioning because I think the rate is too low. If we would increase the rate of those products, we would get them to perform much better. But they are going for a price point, and we're not getting the weed control we'd really like to see. And so that brings me to my last point, which is that we oftentimes try to make a combination product as an adjuvant. So it contains surfactant plus AMS. It contains drift reduction agents, deposition agents, oils, things like that. And as we make these combination products, you can only put so much in a gallon. So oftentimes, in order to get everything into a gallon and get a decent price point, manufacturers will compromise and come up short on one of the functions because there's not enough of that material in there. And so oftentimes the thing that gets shorted is the water conditioning. So hopefully you understand that. And all adjuvants are not created equal. Get ones that work for you, get ones that work very well for you. And thank you for your attention. I believe it's time for Joe.
Um, Before we jump right to Joe, we just had a couple questions during your presentation
Okay.
that might be good to address now. One of the questions is, does solid AMS outperform Class Act NG as an adjuvant? I think AMS is the active ingredient of Class Act.
So the Classic NG is a convenience product. It contains AMS. It contains high fructose corn syrup as a humectant, keep things wet longer, and it contains a very good surfactant. So it depends on what you need. If it was something like Velvet Leaf, AMS is the workhorse in that deal, and so they would perform about the same. On lamb's quarter, you really like to have a surfactant there. And so then the Class Act will look much better than the AMS will. And then there's some things that need both of those. And Class Act is a convenient product. It's a liquid which you pump instead of a dry that you have to dissolve and things like that. And I will say this, water temperature is important. So I do have people both in Minnesota and Wisconsin that for the first week or 10 days of the season, they will heat their water up to like 110 degrees and they'll mix with hot water. And then as soon as water warms up and things like that, they'll quit doing that. So
Then another question, can weed resistance be masked as merely using poor quality water when applying herbicides if there is crystallization on plant leaves?
so either way you'll get poor results. So if you have bad water and a bad application, you will get poor results. They actually have to go and do a lot of investigation, which they do at NDSU, in order to determine if it's from resistance or just a bad application. And I'll let maybe Joe answer more of that. But right now I'm on a rant. It's like you have to get every growing point. When you spray, you need to get every growing point because you have to kill every growing point. So yeah, there's plenty of bad applications out there, and we do have plenty of resistance out there.
Yep. And last question before we move on to Joe, just because this does come up a lot. Uh, does going above that 8.5 pounds per 100 gallons of AMS, would that improve weed control? And how much more can we add?
I have seen situations with glufosinate where you can actually add too much AMS, and then it depends. It depends on what you start with. I will say this that AMS can improve weed control of kochia, and it would be susceptible kochia and velvet leaf if you use distilled water. So that AMS is giving you a benefit even if you've got good water. So I encourage the use of that. And then it depends on how much you need for conditioning as well. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. What we see a lot of times is there is a plateau. If you get to a level of AMS that's a good amount, additional amounts of AMS are really not needed. When we did a study with this with the glufosinate on a lot of locations, and actually what we found was that if you put in additional AMS, about half the time you didn't need it, and then a quarter of the time you really did need it, and then some of the times it actually made the weed control worse. And so you need to get enough AMS in there to do the job that it needs to do.
Okay. Well, we have a couple more questions, but we'll push it to the end. That way we can
Okay.
give Joe an opportunity to present. So Joe, I'll give you the floor.
Sounds good. Yeah, and one thing I was follow up on kind of at the end of that, AMS discussion there at the end is that we often will have these AMS rates, and water conditioning is certainly a part of it. Having the nitrogen in there is also another part of it. And then Greg kind of alluded to this, but several of our weed species, we actually need higher AMS rates because of the crystals on the surface of that leaf. And a velvet leaf is a perfect example where there's calcium on the surface of a velvet leaf plant. And so you can have these interactions if you have a spray water droplet deposited on there, that some of the calcium on the velvet leaf surface can actually bind some herbicides. So I set that up because I'm going to show an equation that was developed here about how much AMS do you need to condition your water. But that's often why we will recommend higher rates, especially in some environments and with some weeds, because there's this interaction on a weed surface that we also have to account for. So as with everything in agronomy, um, if I had an unlimited budget, we would screen every herbicide combination with every water quality combination against every weed species to get all the answers. But unfortunately, we kind of have to be targeted sometimes with budgets and time and other things. So one of the things that Greg mentioned is the NDSU weed guide, and my name is on top because I get to be the one that edits things these days. But this is really 65 years of research that goes into this guide. So right where I'm sitting in my office, I can look up and go back to the first one. Wasn't quite 65 years ago, but this is the 65th anniversary of Dr. John Nalawaya starting at NDSU. So with some of the sections there that Greg pointed out, and this is just a screenshot straight out of the guide, so page 132. If you Google NDSU weed guide, you can find it online right now. But just want to kind of point out some of the things that are in that guide. And I just mentioned about calculating the AMS. How much do you need to condition your water? So let me actually get my laser pointer out here. And on the right side of the screen, or the right side of the page in this guide, there is a calculation. And so Dr. Nalawaya and some of his team several years ago conducted a lot of research in the lab to see, all right, if you take a water quality result, and it says you have 1,000 parts per million of calcium. Well, how much AMS do you need to overcome that calcium? And then that's where this number comes from. So 0.009 times your part per million, and that kind of funnels back into this equation of pounds of AMS per 100 gallons. So we talk about it on a per 100 gallon rate because this is to condition the water. Oftentimes in our geography, we will talk about 2 to 3 pounds of AMS per acre. But if we're conditioning water, we have to think about it as the water in the tank. So think of it as that percent volume to volume type of equation, or percent weight to volume. So I just want to kind of highlight that part of it. We know how much we need to overcome hard water antagonism. But as we mentioned, or just mentioned a few minutes ago, things like velva leaf, lamb's quarters have additional minerals on the leaf surface where we actually need to go higher than that. So kind of a little bit more background there on some of the AMS rates. Looks like when I blew this up, it got a little bit blurry, but I really just want to take some of these sections throughout the guide and highlight what we have in there. Because as I mentioned, there's 65 years of research in there, and we've got about 15 to 20 minutes to degrade that and boil it down today. So water pH has probably been one of the number one questions this winter. So I am glad that a lot of folks are now thinking more about their water quality, and pH has been one that's really come to the surface time and again. And often it's because we will talk about things like lowering the pH of the water to make some of our herbicides, like weak acid herbicides, work better. But there are herbicides that we actually need to raise the pH to help them go into solution. There's also the caveat that some of these herbicides, when we raise that water pH, or I should just say in the presence of higher pH water, can degrade relatively quickly. And these tend to be our group 14 herbicides, Cobra, which is lactofen, Resource, Valor, or flumioxazin. These are herbicides that are more soluble at higher pH, but if we have them in that high pH situation, they can degrade rather quickly. So it can become this balancing act of, if we want to make that dissolve, have that higher pH, but if we have rain delay, just recognize that we can have some degradation occurring. And that's kind of a long version of what this blurry paragraph is more or less saying. Again, this is really just kind of highlighting that equation again, but I actually have it in a less blurry form here in a couple slides. So if we kind of step back and focus on spray water quality, there really are 4 things that we tend to focus on. And Greg spent quite a bit of time discussing water hardness, and I like to think of this as these are the cations in our water. And most of this, we'll see this on a water quality test. It is important to know, and Greg didn't mention this does kind of go back to chemistry. So if we have a calcium cation that's got 2 positive charges, and Greg had that nice cartoon that showed, well, that can bind 2 different glyphosate molecules. Something like sodium, 1 positive charge, maybe only binds one glyphosate molecule, if we use that as the example. Iron can be in a couple different forms, but essentially we know based on, and this kind of does go back into that equation, about how much AMS we need to overcome the hard water quality. So in general, if we like to generalize, these hard water cations will affect our weak acid herbicides that have that negative affinity on the end of a molecule somewhere. Bicarbonates tend to be our anions in the water. So these are not as commonly found if we look at the map of the U.S. This can be a major issue, certainly in the western part of North Dakota. No doubt there's going to be some areas in Minnesota where we have some bicarbonate issues. And these are generally just this negative charge that can affect certain herbicides. And the ones most commonly associated as having a negative effect are the DIMs, so clethodim, so one of our grass killers, and phenoxies like 2,4-D. And specifically, there's a lot of research on 2,4-D amine. And so this is, not a large class of herbicides that get negatively impacted by bicarbonates, but some very important ones. So if we enlist one and have a clethodim in there to clean up some volunteer grass, this could be a big player. So these will show up on your water quality report, and it's important to talk about. I'll spend quite a few slides talking about pH. I'd say historically maybe it's overlooked, but again, many folks are taking a much harder look at that over the last year or two. And we can have a range that comes out of our sources. We could have a pH of 4 to almost up to 10, depending on the source, whether it's coming out of the ground, out of the tap right here in Fargo, or a municipality type water source. It is important to know your pH. And you don't need one of these $1,000 pH meters that we will use in the lab. I often like just go to your local spa store. The pH strips that we use in hot tubs and pools to test the pH, those work perfectly well for a quick way to test your pH. So I would certainly recommend if you don't know the pH of the water you are using, buy some of those strips and figure out the pH that it comes out on. And then turbidity, I won't spend a whole lot of time on turbidity. I say it's rare-ish. This is basically particles in your water. And I go back to the drought of 2021. We did have some folks in the northern part of the valley and up into Manitoba that were basically faced with they had to draw water out of the Red River. And that is going to have a lot of soil particles. And actually, sorry, soil scientists, I'm going to call it dirt for this presentation. So it's going to have some dirt particles in there, and those can really bind some of our herbicides if we don't get it filtered out properly. So specifically glyphosate, specifically paraquat, those will bind almost immediately to any of these clay dirt particles and can be just rendered useless, essentially. So it's usually with some very hard water, in this case, hard being clay or dirt particles, more so than just focusing on some of these cations for the water hardness. So can be a major issue, but we don't talk about it a whole lot because a lot of our sources don't quite have that issue with them. If you want to take 20 minutes and read 10 to 12 really good pages about adjuvants, Google spray adjuvants, the rest of the story. So search for this. We have it online. We are transitioning some websites right now, so I didn't want to provide an exact link in case it's dead, but you can search this and find this right here. And this was my predecessor, Dr. Zollinger. Really nice summary of over about 12 pages about really a career of research on adjuvants. And I just picked out some of his exact quotes for this water quality presentation. And Greg did touch on this a little bit with lowering your pH or conditioning your water. But a theory has long been postulated that acidifying the spray solution results in greater absorption of weak acid-type herbicides. pH-reducing adjuvants were developed under this belief. However, low pH is not essential to optimize herbicide absorption. And Greg did cover that with the AMS part. So yes, we can lower that pH, but sometimes with some of these combinations, nothing really beats AMS. So you can have these water conditioners, but we also do want some AMS along the way. And here's just one example. So this is a slide that I stole from Dr. Zollinger from data that he got from Dallas Peterson, who was at Kansas State for many, many years. And kind of looking at glyphosate, so he used Roundup Weathermax, and we always kind of apply cut rates in these adjuvant trials of the herbicide to really tease out differences. Looking at AMS, a combination of AMS just plus a typical NIS surfactant, compared to some of these water conditioners on the market. So pretty similar slide data set to what Greg showed towards the end of his presentation. But basically, if we cut this baseline here, glyphosate by itself, depending on the weed species or crop species, between 40 and 70% control can increase at about that 30 to 20% based on the combination by using AMS. And Eric asked about rates. This 5% volume to volume of a liquid AMS, that's your 17 pounds per 100 gallon. So that's higher than that 8.5 pound that we might use as a standardized rate. And then these water conditioners, some of them do quite well. Water conditioner mystery number one, just took out trade names for to keep it anonymous here. Looks as good, maybe in some cases better than having that straight AMS in there. Some of these other ones, Greg mentioned that 0.5% volume to volume rate, not performing as well. So we have plenty of these on the market, but just kind of keep in mind which ones you're using and the rate that comes with them, because it can impact performance, particularly of something like glyphosate. Similar data set. This is just from NDSU, so this is Dr. Zollinger's research. In this case, looking at glyphosate, we had a relatively hard water to start with, so 1,000 parts per million is some hard water. Looking at glyphosate, this green line is with just an NIS. This green line is with NIS plus AMS. So what would basically be our standard recommendation for many glyphosate products. And which products surpass this green line? There's 3 of these water conditioning adjuvants that performed better than that NIS plus AMS combination, kind of our standard. The rest did not perform as well. So again, just kind of showing that there's differences in the marketplace. And this is showing the same thing. Rather than focusing on velvet leaf, this is about 5 different broadleaf species showing the average. And again, 3 of these products kind of outperformed the standard, and the rest were less than that. So that's just kind of the quick story about hardness and conditioning water using AMS compared to some of these replacements. Now, pH. We really should take some time to do this across North Dakota, and I'm sure the data, actually I'm positive we have it, but sometimes you're taking a screenshot to throw together a presentation, and some of my colleagues in Tennessee did a really good job of this a couple of years ago. So 2 or 3 iterations of the dicamba labels several years ago talked about making sure the pH of your final spray solution was above 5. So what Drs. Mueller and Steckel down in Tennessee decided to do is look at their different water quality. So 12 different locations across the state of Tennessee, looks like one bled up into Kentucky, showing that as they drew these different water sources straight off the tap, essentially, they had a range of 4.5 to 8.35 starting pH. And we're going to have similar numbers up here based on where you're at, what your water source is. So you can have a pretty high range of pHs depending on where you're at within a given state and what your water source is. Now, what they then decided to do is they added different dicamba formulations that were available in the marketplace at the time and different glyphosate salts. Just for time's sake, I'm going to focus on this glyphosate table on the right side. And the important numbers here are at the bottom. So they categorized or grouped their pHs into a high pH starting water, a low pH starting water, and then use distilled water or DI water. And their starting pH values are here at the bottom. So their high pH water started at 7.7, low pH started at 4.7, and then their distilled water was at 6.2. Some herbicides, and glyphosate is one of the most prominent ones, these formulations and the active ingredients themselves will actively lower your spray solution pH. So basically, if you add glyphosate, here's just an IPA formulation. Here's a K salt, potassium salt like Roundup Power Max. When you started at a pH 7.7, just adding glyphosate dropped it about 2 to 2.5 units, down to that 5 range. Did not move the needle a whole lot when we started with the pH of 4.7. So this glyphosate has a lot of buffering capacity and can lower that pH to where it needs to be to work best as an active ingredient. Distilled water, kind of the same. We dropped it about 2, maybe 1.5 pH units. So I just want us all to keep that in mind, that some of these herbicides, again, glyphosate being the most prominent, will lower the pH of that spray solution. So we might start at 8, we add glyphosate, then all of a sudden you're down in that 5 range. Now, we often will talk about wanting to acidify spray solutions, but there are these herbicides I mentioned earlier that we want that higher pH. So Dr. Nalawai and his team were really one of the first ones to make this basic blend or basic pH blend adjuvant class several decades ago. And these were developed at the time for use with sulfonylurea herbicides. We use quite a lot of these in small grain production. We'll use some in soybean as well and some corn trials. So any of those sulfonylureas, if we think of corn that's nicosulfuron or accent, express tribenuron, use a lot of that in our burn down situations. They are most soluble at higher pHs. And so this class of adjuvant was built to raise our pH to make those chemistries more soluble. Now, along the way, we've had some other herbicides come along. If we focus on a few of them, Everest is flucarbazone. That's not a sulfonylurea, but is a group 2 herbicide as well, more soluble in that higher pH. Saflufenicil or Sharpen, one of these ones more soluble at higher pH. And many of our group 27 herbicides, Callisto is mesotrione, Laudis is tembotrione. These are more water soluble at that high pH. So what does this look like? So I want to focus on some data that we have out there with Sharpen or saflufenicil. And if you just have different starting pHs and add saflufenicil, here's what your spray tank might look like. So lower pH, all that white and foaming you're seeing in there, that's just saflufenicil not being fully dissolved. Whereas pH of 7.7 or of 9, that is fully dissolved in solution, and that is why it's looking quite clear. So very soluble at the higher pHs. Does this translate to weed control? Greg kind of alluded to this sometimes. But when it does translate to weed control, it is more favorable to have this higher pH. So this is some research out of Indiana, but showing common lamb's quarters, giant ragweed, a couple different ways to look at this. I'm just going to focus on this giant ragweed and one on the bottom here, where this first experimental run they conducted, when you had that starting pH of 9 or 7.7, that was your best control. pH of 6.5 was similar statistically, but then with our lower pHs of 5.2 or 4.0, we lost control of giant ragweed when we were spraying just saflufenicil. And again, that goes back to it was not fully dissolved in the solution. Plants don't drink rocks. Now, we rarely put out saflufenicil by itself. We often have a tank mix with glyphosate. And so here's some data from Dr. Brian Young at Purdue showing a tank mix of glyphosate with saflufenicil or Sharpen on a glyphosate-resistant weed, in this case, horseweed, and with different adjuvants to boot as well. So we will always recommend an MSO-based adjuvant with saflufenicil or Sharpen, but showing what happens if you use petroleum or crop oil and then just a straight surfactant. If the spray solution pH was 5, anywhere from 40 to 77% control. If we had that spray solution pH up to 7, we increased control across adjuvant classes and got 94% control when we use that MSO base. So again, highlighting here, saflufenicil will perform better at higher pH. I will say that caveat, if we go back to some of my comments at the beginning, is that it can degrade relatively quickly, especially once we get into that pH of 9. So we can play this game and adjust the pH, but just keep in mind, if you get a rain delay, that's tank has to be parked for a few days. We can have some degradation occur. Now, last little 2 slides here. I'm going to cheat a little bit. So I know we've talked about water quality as the title of this webinar. I'm going to extend it out to our spray solution. And this is something that we have really talked about a lot in our geography. This message might get lost a little bit the further east you go within the U.S. And talk about the oil rate that we use when we use a COC or an MSO. So decades ago, when these were developed, we would often talk about using these oils on an area basis, 1 to 2 pint per acre, what might be our recommendation based on the oil that you are using. Somewhere along the line, the last 20, 30 years, as herbicide labels have been written, we've kind of gone to this standard of 1% volume to volume. And here's where I'm cheating. It's part of your water quality. If 1% of your spray solution is oil, that's kind of the recommendation. A lot of herbicide labels are written under the understanding that 15 GPA is just the standard that we write herbicide labels on. And if you do the math, 1% of 15 gallons would get you 1.2 pints of oil per acre. If you go higher than that, 20 gallon per acre, that's 1.6 pints per acre. That's within that recommended range. If we use 10 or 5 gallons per acre and go with that 1% volume to volume, now we have less than a pint of oil per acre. And this can be reflected in weed control. So here's some data from Dr. Zollinger once again. I'm going to focus on MSO here at the top. A couple of different things going on the slide. The white bar is a carrier volume of 8.5 gallons per acre. The gray bar is a carrier volume of 17 gallons per acre. The numbers here are the percent volume to volume. So, and then on the left here is our pint per acre rate. So if we focus on this bar here, 1.4 pints per acre of oil at 8.5 gallons per acre is 2% volume to volume. At 17 gallons per acre is 1%. So if we're spraying at 17 GPA and we do 1% volume to volume, that gets us 1.4 pints per acre. But if we cut our carrier volume in half, that gets us down to 0.7 pints per acre. And this is reflected in the control. So if we just kind of compare, again, 1% volume to volume at 8.5 gallons per acre, that's at 0.7 pints, gave us about 50% control. That higher volume gave us about 65%. So this can be reflected in the data. So a very nice slide and research data set from Dr. Zollinger kind of highlighting that concept. So the last thing I just want to do is highlight, so I've got a podcast, War Against Weeds. We have episodes almost every week. One of the reasons I want to highlight it is if you want to know more about spray solution quality, if you go back and look in the season 9, episode 2, we had Tom Wolf on. Very, very fantastic guest to have on, very knowledgeable. He's part of Sprayers 101, and they do a lot of good work highlighting things like water quality, anything to do with the sprayer. So if you want to kind of a more long-form version, talk about water quality and want to listen to Dr. Wolf, check out that episode at least. Otherwise, ending here, I don't know if this QR code is actually active, so I'm not going to stick here too long. But again, highlighting a lot of this information is found in the NDSU Weed Guide. And Eric, that is all I had prepared.
Great. We do have a few questions. First, you mentioned degradation of active ingredients due to spray pH. How quickly does that happen?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It can happen within a couple hours with something like saflufenicil if we have that pH up towards 9. Now, if we generalize, herbicides will be more stable compared to some of our insecticides and fungicides. So I won't go into the specifics because that's a class of pesticides I don't normally deal with. But I do know some of these insecticides can degrade within minutes at some of these pH extremes. Yeah. So herbicide's a bit more stable, and maybe Greg has some more information about that as well.
So I would say that, yeah, you're looking at anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. And then one that I would add on to Joe's list is that clethodim's a little sketchy to begin with. And so I would be really worried about having clethodim sit in the tank for any period of time.
Good. And Joe, you mentioned a few of those conditioners in the research. How much of those are CPDA adjuvant certified?
So it was a blind test. Yep. And so we don't know what all of the candidates were on purpose. Yep. But I do know that there were several Winfield products there, and all of those are in fact CPDA certified adjuvants.
Okay. And Joe, you shared some research on the glyphosate with water conditioners, and that was at 1,000 parts per million hard water. How does that compare to maybe what growers might expect in their own tank or water source?
Yes, that's a great question, and that can go back to that map that Greg showed. So 1,000 parts per million might be soft water if I'm in Western North Dakota. It's going to be very hard compared to if I go, if I pull out of a municipality. Uh, so if you pull off of Fargo Water or Jamestown, whatever it is, that's already been conditioned, and some of those hard water ions have been removed. So that is going to be hard compared to that. In general, we talk about once we get over 600 parts per million, that's when we call it hard water and really need to pay attention to conditioning that water. But 1,000 parts per million can be light compared to some of the sources we use out west.
So one of the things that I've found over the years, and we've taken actually thousands of water samples, um, usually the city water is not real bad, and the rural water systems are not real bad, and the wells are all over the place. You've got very good wells, you've got awful wells, and the closer you get to the Rocky Mountains, the worse the water qualities are. So that Western Dakota area, yeah, there's many of those, not many, but you can find a well pretty easily that is over 2,000 parts per million. And then kind of another area that I know quite well, um, in southwestern Minnesota, that's fairly hard water. And it takes about 2.5 um, uh, pounds of AMS just to condition the water. And we're going to see an additional AMS benefit there from using AMS. That's something that we noticed over time was that and you could probably get by with less than 8.5 pounds in that area, but I wouldn't shave it very far. So um, yeah, we'll just kind of go with that. But we definitely need water conditioning throughout most of both states. So,
Then just to kind of go off on that, how much of an impact does chlorinated water have on herbicide efficacy if you are near a city water supply to fill tanks?
I'm not aware that chlorine is going to be bad for the herbicide solutions. I mean, um, it's not like some of the seed treatments and the inoculants where chlorine is really bad. It's just going to have an effect on pH. It's going to give you a negative charge. I'm not aware that it's going to be a huge problem there for herbicides.
Um, and then this is maybe a good one for both. Or Joe, did you have any comments on?
No, no, I was just going to agree. And yeah, that chlorination is part of the water treatment process. And a lot of our trials that we conduct, we just pull off the tap and it's going to have some of that chlorinated water. And we can control weeds just fine if we do everything else right.
Yep.
Then how is the best way to test water? Are there differences in results based on how you test it?
So I would send it to a laboratory. You can do it at NDSU, Agvise up in the Northern Valley, and then Midwest Labs. They all can do that. The thing that I would suggest is you want to have it come back as parts per million because some of them will send them back as grains, and that means you got to do a little bit more math to figure out what your numbers are.
Yeah, as far as like testing itself, I know those labs are going to be a standardized protocol, so pick your favorite one. But I'd probably let the water itself run for a little bit before you collect that sample.
Yeah.
And I will kind of highlight we've all had fire hydrants charged, and you go home and turn the water on, and just kind of spurts at you real quick. And that first time you turn the tap on, it's going to have a lot more stuff in there. And so if you want to get your average sample at 1,000 gallons, turn the pump on, get it running for a bit, and then take that collection. Don't grab the first thing that comes out, especially if you haven't used that water source in 6 months.
Well, and I'll just do a quick add-on to that. So if you have worked on your plumbing to that water supply, I would let it I would test it sometime after you've done your repairs. So I wouldn't do it right away, but I would definitely check it after your repairs. So
Then as we kind of get into more drone applications of herbicides. How does this all relate as far as the amount of conditioner or adjuvants needed when people are spraying low volumes?
Is it 10 o'clock yet? Nope, darn it. It does change the game. So yeah, a lot of what we were discussing is more of these ground applications that'll be more prominent. But if I just look at oil discussion, a pint per acre of oil in 1 gallon per acre is a lot higher percentage of that spray volume than 15 gallons per acre. Yep. And I talked first because I know Greg has a little bit of insight on this, so I figured I'd set it up, and he's got some data, I think.
So I'm not sure about all of the products, but when you're using a drone, you're fighting against evaporation. So the water is going to go away, and so you can end up with the crystals that you saw earlier. There is some really good data that Nalawaya did years and years ago where he compared 2.5 gallons of water or spray solution to 5 to 10 to 20, and looking at real crappy water at those water volumes. And so when you're reducing those water volumes, your actual need for the water conditioner goes down, because if you have 2,000 parts per million and you've only got a half a gallon of that, and most of that's going to evaporate, you're still going to get pretty good control. Whereas if you did that with 20 gallons per acre, you're going to get really crappy control. So we'll just leave it at that. But as you move to lower and lower water volumes where you can use less and less of the water conditioning. Now, having said that, we talked about the AMS with the distilled water, but you're going to have a problem hauling everything you need to with a drone application.
Thank you. And then just a couple last questions as we finish off the session. It's a question on how does humic acid behave in tank mix versus AMS? And we have a question on a different insecticide or pesticide class. What is the ideal pH for fungicides, if anyone has an input on that?
So I'll do the fungicide one first. The fungicide one, I would try to recommend being as close to 7 as you can get. Avoid extremes on both ends. And then, and I'll let Joe say anything he wants to there.
Now, I don't work with fungicides, so
All right.
I can tell you it might vary by class.
And the humic
sides.
Yeah. And the humic acid is kind of acts like a sequestering agent. But you may tie up your actives in there too, especially if they're acid, weak acids, stuff like that. I would much rather use the AMS. You know what you're going to get. The other one, I'm not sure what they're trying to do with the humic acid.
We are at that 10 o'clock mark, so we want to first thank everyone for joining us on Strategic Farming. Let's Talk Crops. We also want to thank the sponsors again, Minnesota Soybean Research and Promotion Council, as well as the Minnesota Corn Research and Promotion Council. Just a reminder, next week our webinar is on planting and investment returns with Dr. Stephanie and Dr. Jeff Coulter. And we want to again thank Joe Ikley and Greg Dahl for joining us for today's session. It's very informative. Thank you guys. And you guys have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.